The jungle screamed, not with voices, but with the kind of silence that preceded violence, thick, wet, suffocating. Private First Class Daniel Reeves crouched in the mud of Guadalcanal, his fingers wrapped around something that didn't belong in this war. The 10-gauge shotgun felt wrong in his hands, too heavy, too crude, too American for a battlefield where rifles and bayonets wrote the rules of engagement. But Sergeant Kowalski had pressed it into his arms 3 days ago, with eyes that held no room for questions. "You'll understand when the time comes," Kowalski had said, his Polish accent thick with something between warning and prayer. The weapon was a relic from another era, a hunting piece that some supply officer with either genius or madness had requisitioned from the sporting goods warehouses back in the States. Its barrel was scarred, its stock worn smooth by hands that had once tracked deer through Wisconsin forests, not men through tropical hell. Daniel could smell the gun oil mixed with rot, with the sweet, sick perfume of decomposing vegetation, with his own fierce sweat that had soaked through 3 uniforms since they'd landed on this cursed island. Behind him, Corporal Jimmy Chen checked his carbine for the 14th time in as many minutes. Jimmy was from San Francisco, the son of immigrants who'd been rounded up and sent to Manzanar while their boy fought for the country that imprisoned them. He never talked about it. None of them talked about the things that hurt too much. Instead, Jimmy hummed, quiet, almost inaudible melodies that Daniel had learned were old Cantonese lullabies his grandmother had taught him before the war swallowed everything familiar. "You hear that?" Jimmy whispered, his humming stopping mid-note. Daniel heard everything and nothing. The jungle had 1,000 voices, insects drilling their eternal songs, birds that sounded like dying men, leaves dripping with yesterday's rain. But underneath it all, there was something else, a rhythm. Footsteps trying to be silent but betrayed by the terrain that refused to keep secrets. "Contact front," Daniel breathed into the radio handset, his voice barely above a whisper. 200 yards, maybe less. Static crackled back, then Lieutenant Morrison's voice, tinny and distant. "Hold position. Let him come to you. Remember the briefing." The briefing. Daniel's mind flashed back to the tent where Morrison had spread out captured Japanese documents, pointing at tactical diagrams with a cigarette that trembled slightly in his fingers. The lieutenant was 24 years old and already looked 50, hollow-eyed, thin in a way that had nothing to do with rations and everything to do with watching too many boys become corpses. "They're going to charge," Morrison had said, tapping ash onto a map of ridgelines and ravines. "It's doctrine for them. Banzai attacks. Human waves. They believe dying for the emperor is the highest honor. They're trained to close distance, to use cold steel, to overwhelm with numbers and ferocity." Private Eddie Kowalski, the sergeant's younger brother, barely 19, had raised his hand like they were still in a classroom back in Milwaukee. "Sir, what do we do when they come?" Morrison had looked at him for a long moment, then gestured to the crates being unloaded by the supply team. "We give them something they've never seen before, something that changes the rules at close range." That's when Daniel had first seen the shotguns. Now, crouched in the mud with Japanese infantry approaching through the green wall, Daniel understood why some weapons became legends and others became nightmares. The 10-gauge wasn't a rifle. It didn't require precision at distance. It wasn't about honor or glory or clean kills at 400 yards. It was about survival in the space where breath and blood mixed, where you could see your enemy's eyes and they could see yours. The footsteps grew louder. Daniel checked the weapon one more time, a habit that Sergeant Kowalski had drilled into all of them during those frantic training sessions in the rain. Load, check, safety off. Brace. The shells were buckshot, 9 pellets of lead per round, each one capable of punching through muscle and bone at the ranges they'd be fighting. He had 8 shells in the tube, 1 in the chamber. 9 chances to survive what was coming. "Danny," Jimmy whispered, using the nickname that felt like home, like the neighborhood in Brooklyn where they'd both grown up on different blocks of the same struggling street. You remember what Kowalski said? Daniel nodded, though Jimmy probably couldn't see it in the shadows. Aim low. Let the spread do the work. Don't think, just react. No, Jimmy said, his voice soft but urgent. The other thing, about going home. The memories surfaced like a body from deep water. Kowalski, drunk on captured sake, sitting on an ammunition crate under stars that looked nothing like the stars back home. You boys are gonna make it, he'd slurred, pointing at them with a bottle. You're gonna go home and have families and tell stories about this place, and those stories are gonna be lies because nobody who wasn't here can understand the truth. But you'll be alive to lie. That's what matters. I remember, Daniel said. The jungle erupted. They came through the undergrowth like ghosts given form, 20, 30, maybe more Japanese soldiers, their uniforms stained with mud and blood, their faces set in expressions that mixed fury with something transcendent, something beyond fear. They screamed as they charged, a sound Daniel would hear in his sleep for the rest of his life. Tenno hika banzai, long live the emperor. Daniel's training took over. His body moved before his mind caught up. The shotgun rose to his shoulder, the heavy barrel tracking movement through the green chaos. The first Japanese soldier broke through a wall of ferns 15 yards away, bayonet fixed, rifle raised, eyes locked on Daniel with the absolute certainty of a man already dead. Daniel pulled the trigger. The 10-gauge roared like thunder contained in steel. The recoil slammed into his shoulder with bruising force, driving him back a step. Through the gun smoke and his own adrenaline, he saw the soldier's chest explode in a spray of red, saw the man's forward momentum turn into a spinning, broken fall. The body hit the mud and didn't move. But there were more. Always more. Jimmy's carbine chattered beside him, short, controlled bursts that were textbook perfect. 2 more Japanese soldiers went down, then a third, but the charge didn't stop. It never stopped. That was what Morrison had tried to explain, what the briefing couldn't really convey. The Japanese infantry fought with a spiritual mathematics that didn't account for casualties, only objectives. Daniel pumped the shotgun, ejecting a spent shell in an arc of brass. Another soldier emerged, this one closer, 10 yards, close enough that Daniel could see the individual features of his face, the fear beneath the fury, the way his hands gripped the rifle like a lifeline to meaning. Daniel fired again. The spread pattern at this range was devastating, turning one projectile into 9 instruments of violence. The soldier went down in a tumbling sprawl. Pump, aim, fire. Pump, aim, fire. The actions became a rhythm, a dance of survival choreographed by desperation. The 10-gauge's report was different from the carbines, from the rifles, from every other weapon on the battlefield. It was deeper, more primal, the sound of a weapon designed to bring down large game, translated into the ugly mathematics of human combat. Each blast seemed to push back the jungle itself, creating momentary pockets of clarity in the chaos. A Japanese soldier made it through the storm of lead, his bayonet aimed at Daniel's gut. Time dilated in the way it does when death comes close enough to smell. Gunsmoke and cordite mixing with the iron scent of blood and the acrid stench of fear sweat. Daniel saw everything, the nick on the bayonet's edge, the way the soldiers' pupils were blown wide with whatever mixture of drugs and doctrine kept them charging, the small photograph tucked into his helmet band showing a woman and child. The shotgun was empty. Daniel had counted wrong, or not counted at all, and now there was nothing between him and the blade but air and intention. Jimmy's carbine barked once. The Japanese soldier's head snapped back and he collapsed like a puppet with cut strings, falling so close that his blood splattered Daniel's boots. "Reload!" Jimmy shouted, his voice cracking with adrenaline and terror kept carefully controlled. Daniel's hands moved mechanically, ejecting spent shells and thumbing fresh ones into the tube. His fingers were shaking now, the adrenaline giving way to the first waves of shock. Around them, the firefight continued, other squads engaging, the rattle of machine guns from the ridge, the distinctive crack of Japanese Arisaka rifles returning fire. Mortars began to fall, their whistle and crump adding percussion to the symphony of violence. Then, as suddenly as it began, the charge broke. The surviving Japanese soldiers melted back into the jungle, dragging some of their wounded, leaving others. The silence that followed was worse than the noise, heavy with the moans of dying men, with the drip of blood into mud and the ringing in Daniel's ears that would never quite go away. "Count off!" Sergeant Kowalski's voice cut through the aftermath, rough and commanding. "Sound off by number!" The squad called out, 9 voices where there had been 12 that morning. Daniel's stomach turned. Private Eddie Kowalski didn't answer. Neither did Thompson nor Rodriguez. The sergeant's face went through a series of transformations in the space of 3 seconds. Grief, rage, forced calm. "Chen, Reeves, check the perimeter," Kowalski said. "Everyone else, prepare for medvac and resupply." Daniel and Jimmy moved through the carnage, checking bodies, American and Japanese both. It was necessary work, grim but vital. You had to know who was dead and who could be saved, what intelligence could be gathered from the enemy casualties, what weapons could be salvaged. Daniel tried not to look at faces, but it was impossible. Each corpse had been a person with a name, a family, a life that ended in this green hell for reasons that seemed increasingly abstract the longer the war went on. They found Eddie Kowalski slumped against a tree, his chest torn open by rifle fire. His eyes were still open, staring at the canopy above, where brief slashes of blue sky showed through. His hand was wrapped around a small wooden cross his mother had sent from Milwaukee. Daniel had seen him clutch it every night before sleep, lips moving in silent prayer. "Sarge," Jimmy called out softly, "you need to come here." What followed was the sound Daniel would never forget, the animal keen of a man whose brother had just died, a noise that started in the sergeant's gut and tore its way out through his throat, bypassing language entirely. Kowalski held Eddie for 10 minutes while the squad secured the perimeter and Lieutenant Morrison called in the casualty report. Nobody tried to hurry him. Some things were beyond military efficiency. When Kowalski finally stood, his face was different, harder, colder, like something essential had been burned out of him. He looked at the 10-gauge shotgun Daniel still held, at the spent shell scattered around their position, at the Japanese bodies that formed a rough semicircle of death. "How many?" Kowalski asked. "Sir? How many did you put down with that thing?" Daniel thought back through the blur of combat, tried to count. 5, maybe 6. Kowalski nodded slowly, his jaw working. They didn't expect it. You could see it in their faces, couldn't you? That moment when they realized what they were running into. Daniel had seen it. That flicker of surprise, of calculation interrupted, of doctrine meeting a weapon that rewrote the rules of close combat. The Japanese infantry were trained for bayonet charges, for overwhelming American positions with speed and numbers and the fanatical courage of men prepared to die. They weren't prepared for weapons that turned 15 yards into a killing field, that made close combat suicidal instead of glorious. "Sir?" Lieutenant Morrison approached, his uniform soaked with sweat and someone else's blood. "Regiment wants a full report on the shotgun's effectiveness. Command is considering wider distribution." Kowalski's laugh was bitter, empty. "Effectiveness. My brother is dead, but the weapon is effective, so that's what matters, right, Lieutenant?" Morrison's face tightened, but he didn't rise to the anger. Your brother is dead because we're fighting an enemy that values death over surrender, because this island is a meat grinder, and because war is the ugliest thing humans ever invented. The shotgun didn't kill Eddie. The Japanese infantry killed Eddie. And if these weapons can save even one more brother, one more son, one more father, then yes, Sergeant, effectiveness matters. The two men stared at each other across Eddie Kowalski's body, across the philosophical chasm that separated those who led and those who followed, those who thought strategically and those who bled personally. Finally, Kowalski nodded, a fractional movement that conceded nothing but acknowledged everything. We'll write the report, but after we bury our dead. They buried them that evening as the sun set over Guadalcanal, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful anywhere else. Eddie Kowalski went into the mud with his wooden cross clutched in hands that would never age, never hold grandchildren, never build the life his mother had prayed for in that Milwaukee church every Sunday. Daniel stood at attention during the chaplain's words, the 10-gauge shotgun slung across his back, because even funerals on Guadalcanal happened within range of enemy mortars. The weapon felt heavier now, weighted with the knowledge of what it could do, what it had done. He thought about the Japanese soldiers he'd killed, boys really, probably no older than Eddie, probably with mothers who prayed in different languages to different gods for the same impossible thing, that their sons would come home.
After the service, as the squad dispersed to their foxholes and guard rotations, Jimmy found Daniel sitting on an ammunition crate, cleaning the 10-gauge with an almost obsessive attention to detail. "You okay?" Jimmy asked, though it was a stupid question. Nobody was okay. Okay had been left behind somewhere in the Pacific, probably floating in the ocean between Pearl Harbor and here. "I keep thinking about their faces," Daniel admitted. "The ones I shot. They looked surprised." "They should be surprised," Jimmy said, his voice carrying an edge Daniel had never heard before. "They started this war. They bombed us, invaded everyone in the Pacific, and now they act like dying for their emperor makes them noble. But you know what? Dead is dead, noble or not. And I'd rather they be dead than you." It was the most Jimmy had said about the war in months, and the bitterness in his voice spoke to something deeper. The internment camps, the stolen homes, the casual racism that had followed his family even as their son bled for America. Daniel wanted to say something profound, something that would acknowledge the injustice and the irony and the twisted logic that let America fight fascism abroad while practicing it at home. But there were no words big enough for that contradiction. "The chaplain said Eddie's in a better place," Daniel offered instead. Jimmy's laugh was short, sharp. "Eddie's in a hole in the ground on an island nobody cared about 6 months ago. There's no better place, Denny. There's just here and not here. Living and dead. That's all war gives us." They sat in silence as night fell completely, as the jungle around them came alive with sounds that might be animals or might be enemy scouts. Somewhere in the distance, artillery thundered, American guns supporting a push on another ridge, another hill, another objective that would be paid for in blood and given a name and number that would appear in history books as if that made the cost worthwhile. Daniel thought about the 10-gauge, about the way it had changed the mathematics of that firefight, about the surprise in the eyes of men who had expected to die gloriously and instead died shocked. He wondered if this was what winning looked like. Not honor or valor or any of the words used in the recruitment posters, but just the brutal calculus of who died surprised and who died expecting it. Morrison's right, you know, about the weapon. If it saves lives, American lives, then it's worth using. I know that sounds cold, but we didn't make the rules of this war. We're just trying to survive them. Is that enough? Just surviving? It's everything. Because if we don't survive, we can't go home, can't rebuild, can't make sure this never happens again. Dead men don't make the world better. They just fertilize jungle's soil. The philosophy was dark, pragmatic, utterly divorced from the patriotic narratives that sent them here. But it was also honest in a way nothing else had been since the first bullets flew. Daniel found himself nodding, accepting it, letting it settle into the space where idealism used to live. In the foxhole they shared that night, taking turns on watch while the other tried to sleep, Daniel dreamed of the 10-gauge shotgun growing larger, heavier, until it was the size of a building, until its barrel was wide enough to swallow the entire island. He dreamed of loading it with shells made of memories, Eddie Kowalski's cross, Jimmy's grandmother's lullabies, his own mother's letters from Brooklyn that talked about rationing and war bonds and neighbors' sons who weren't coming home. When he fired it in the dream, it made no sound. Just silence, spreading out in concentric rings, erasing the jungle, the war, everything. He woke to Jimmy shaking his shoulder. "You watch," Jimmy whispered. "And Danny, you were talking in your sleep. Something about not being able to hear." Daniel took the watch position, the 10-gauge across his knees, and stared out into the darkness where nothing and everything moved. He understood now what Sergeant Kowalski meant 3 days ago. You'll understand when the time comes. The time had come. The understanding was bitter, necessary, and permanent. The jungle continued to scream its silent scream around him, and Private First Class Daniel Reeves counted the hours until dawn with a weapon that had changed the rules and a knowledge that would change him forever. The routine of war was worse than the fighting. Daniel discovered this truth in the days following that first encounter with the Japanese banzai charge, as the adrenaline faded and left behind only the grinding reality of existence on Guadalcanal. The island didn't kill you all at once with heroic violence. It eroded you slowly, through heat that turned uniforms into sweat-soaked rags, through rain that never stopped falling, through mud that claimed boots and hope with equal efficiency, through mosquitoes carrying malaria, through dysentery that hollowed men out from the inside. Every morning began the same way. Wake before dawn, shake out your boots for scorpions, check your weapon, eat whatever passed for breakfast, usually hardtack that tasted like cardboard mixed with disappointment, and wait for orders. The waiting was its own special torture. It left too much time to think, too much space for remembering, too much room for the fear to grow roots in your chest and bloom. Daniel developed rituals to keep the fear manageable. After breakfast, he would clean the 10-gauge shotgun completely, breaking it down into components and wiping each piece with an oilcloth until the metal gleamed. The repetitive motion was meditative, almost prayerful. Each time he reassembled the weapon, he imagined putting himself back together too. Taking the scattered pieces of Private First Class Daniel Reeves' combat infantry and forcing them into a configuration that could function another day. Sergeant Kowalski watched him do this every morning for a week before finally speaking up. "You're gonna wear through the metal if you keep that up," Kowalski said, his voice rough from cigarettes and grief kept carefully bottled. Since Eddie's death, the sergeant had become quieter, more methodical, as if emotions were luxuries he could no longer afford. "Keeps my hands busy," Daniel replied, running the cloth along the barrel one more time. "I get it." Kowalski sat down on an overturned ration crate, lighting a cigarette with hands that shook just slightly. "My father was a coal miner. Came over from Poland with nothing but a strong back and a willingness to go underground. Every morning before his shift, he'd sharpen his pick. Didn't matter if it was already sharp. He'd sit there with a whetstone for 20 minutes, working in the blade edge, humming old country songs. My mother asked him once why he bothered when the mine provided tools. You know what he said? Daniel shook his head, though he could guess. He said the ritual wasn't about the pick. It was about convincing himself he could control something, even if it was just the sharpness of metal that would spend the day breaking rock in darkness. Made him feel less helpless. Kowalski took a long drag, exhaled smoke that hung in the humid air. Eddie used to polish his boots every night, even here where mud made it pointless. Same thing, different ritual. The mention of Eddie hung between them like a ghost given temporary voice. Daniel had noticed that Kowalski never said "my brother" anymore, just Eddie, as if proper titles made the loss more real, more permanent. "Did your father make it? Out of the mines, I mean?"
Lung disease got him when I was 15. Black lung. Coughed himself to death over 2 years, while my mother fed him broth and prayed to saints who never answered. Eddie was only 10. Too young to understand that sometimes the thing you do to survive is the same thing that kills you slowly. The philosophy landed heavy in the morning heat. Daniel thought about the 10 gauge, about how using it had kept him alive, but had also introduced something toxic into his sleep. Recurring dreams where the barrel grew longer, the targets multiplied, the trigger pulls never stopped. Was survival always poisoned like this? Was coming home just a slower way of dying than staying here? Before he could respond, Lieutenant Morrison appeared, looking even more haggard than usual. The lieutenant had lost weight. They all had. But on him it was more pronounced, like a man being consumed by responsibility from the inside out. "Briefing in 10, Morrison announced. "We've got new intel on enemy positions. Also, headquarters wants to talk about weapon effectiveness reports." Sergeant Kowalski stubbed out his cigarette with more force than necessary. "Let me guess. They want numbers? Kill counts? Statistics to justify the shotguns?" "They want to know if the program should expand," Morrison corrected, his voice carefully neutral. "Command is considering issuing them to point men in every squad. That means training protocols, ammunition logistics, doctrine integration. Your squad's experience is the primary data point." Daniel felt something twist in his stomach. The idea that what he'd done, the men he'd killed with the 10 gauge, would become doctrine, would be replicated by thousands of other American soldiers across the Pacific, felt both necessary and monstrous. How do you separate the tactical advantage from the human cost? How do you write a training manual for surviving hell? The briefing took place in a tent that leaked in 4 places, with rain drumming overhead and maps spread across a plywood table that wobbled on uneven ground. The intelligence officer, Captain Hendricks, a former schoolteacher from Ohio with round spectacles and the manner of someone perpetually disappointed by reality, pointed at aerial reconnaissance photos with a wooden pointer. "The Japanese are consolidating here and here," Hendricks said, tapping 2 ridges on the map. "We anticipate they'll attempt another major push within 72 hours. Their doctrine remains unchanged. Close quickly, overwhelm with numbers, use psychological shock through banzai charges." "And we keep mowing them down," someone muttered from the back of the tent.
Hendricks continued, as if he hadn't heard. "However, intelligence suggests they're adapting. Captured documents indicate awareness of American close combat weapons, specifically what they're calling the Thunder Guns. They're drilling their infantry on dispersal tactics and increased use of grenade attacks to suppress defensive positions before closing." Daniel exchanged glances with Jimmy. The Japanese were learning. Of course they were. Wars weren't static. Every tactic generated a counter-tactic. Every weapon spawned a defense. The 10-gauge shotgun had shocked them once, had changed the mathematics of close combat in that first engagement. But shock was a depreciating asset. The second time was always different from the first. Morrison cleared his throat. "Captain, what's the recommendation?" "Hold the line," Hendricks said simply. "Continue current tactics, but expect increased indirect fire before any assault. Artillery support has been requested, but remains limited due to competing priorities in other sectors. You'll be relying primarily on organic firepower and, well," he gestured vaguely toward Daniel's shotgun, which leaned against the tent pole like a sleeping predator, "improvised force multipliers." "Improvised," Kowalski repeated, his voice hard. "Is that what we're calling them? Because I've got another word. Desperate. We're issuing hunting weapons because we don't have enough of the real thing." "Sergeant," Morrison warned. But Kowalski was already rolling, his grief and anger finding an outlet. "My brother died holding a line with a bolt-action rifle against an enemy that doesn't care about dying. We're asking 19-year-old kids to stand in mud with deer guns and stop human waves through sheer firepower. That's not tactics, Captain. That's a meat grinder with patriotic music. The tent went silent, except for the rain. Hendricks looked at Kowalski with something that might have been sympathy or might have been exhaustion. It was hard to tell the difference after enough months of war. "You're right," Hendricks said quietly. "It is desperate. This entire campaign is desperate. We're fighting for an island most Americans couldn't find on a map 6 months ago, using whatever weapons we can scrounge against an enemy that's chosen death over pragmatism. None of this makes sense, Sergeant, but it's what we have. So we use the deer guns and the bolt actions and whatever else works, and we try to make sure more of them die than us. That's the only math that matters." "It mattered to Eddie," Kowalski said, but the fire had gone out of his voice, replaced with something hollow and defeated. After the briefing, Daniel found himself walking the perimeter with Jimmy, ostensibly checking defenses, but really just needing to move, to do something other than sit with the weight of Hendricks' bleak pragmatism. They walked in companionable silence, the kind that only develops between men who've saved each other's lives and know that words are often inadequate anyway. "My grandmother had this saying, Cantonese, translates roughly to, 'The river carves the stone not with force, but with persistence.' She used to say it when things got hard, when my father couldn't find work because of his accent, when neighbors threw rocks at our windows, when the government came and said we had to leave our home because our faces made us suspect." "What does it mean?" Daniel asked. "I used to think it was about patience, about enduring, but now I think it means we're the river, all of us, American, Japanese, everyone caught in this. We just keep flowing, wearing down at each other and at ourselves until we've carved channels in stone, until we've changed the landscape so much that nothing can ever go back to what it was." It was the most poetic thing Daniel had heard since arriving on Guadalcanal, and also the saddest. He thought about rivers, about erosion, about how landscapes transformed so gradually that you didn't notice until one day you looked around and realized everything familiar had become foreign. "Do you still hear your grandmother's lullabies, the ones you hump?" Jimmy nodded. "Every night. She sang them to me when I was little before she passed. My mother tried to teach them to me properly, but I never learned all the words, just the melody. I'm probably humming them wrong, but it's the closest thing to home I can carry."
"What happened to your family?" Daniel ventured. Though he knew he was stepping into territory Jimmy usually kept cordoned off. "After they were sent to Manzanar?" Jimmy's jaw tightened. For a moment, Daniel thought he wouldn't answer, that he'd pushed too far. But then something seemed to crack in Jimmy's careful armor. "My father died there. Heart attack, they said. But really it was shame. The shame of being loyal to a country that locked him up, of having to watch his son go off to fight for the same government that took everything from him. My mother and sister are still there, behind wire, while I'm here with a rifle fighting Japanese soldiers who look like me. You want to talk about irony? That's irony. That's America in 1942. The bitterness was total, and Daniel had no response adequate to it. What could he say? That it was wrong. Obviously it was wrong. That it would get better? Maybe it would, maybe it wouldn't. That Jimmy's service mattered? It did, and it didn't, depending on which truth you prioritized. "I'm sorry," Daniel said finally, because inadequate words were better than silence. "Don't be sorry. Be angry. Stay angry. Because the day we stop being angry about injustice is the day we accept it as normal." Jimmy kicked at a root that had grown across their path. "That's what this war should teach us, if it teaches us anything. Not how to kill better, but why killing becomes necessary when people forget to stay angry about the right things."
They completed the perimeter check in silence, each lost in thoughts too heavy to share. When they returned to the squad area, they found Sergeant Kowalski sitting alone, staring at Eddie's personal effects: a wristwatch, a wallet with photos, the wooden cross that had been pried from dead fingers before burial. "He wanted to be a teacher," Sergeant Kowalski said without looking up. "Eddie. He had a scholarship to a normal school back in Wisconsin. Was going to teach history, of all things. Used to say that understanding the past was how you prevented repeating its mistakes." He laughed bitterly. "Look how well that worked out. All that history, and here we are anyway, making the same mistakes with different uniforms." Daniel sat down across from him, the 10-gauge resting against his knee. What would Eddie say about the shotguns? About us using them? Kowalski considered this, turning the wooden cross over in his hands. "He'd probably quote something pretentious from a book I never read. But if I had to guess, he'd say that weapons aren't good or evil, just tools. It's what we do with them, what we become while using them, that matters. He was naive like that. Believed people were fundamentally decent underneath all the ugliness." Was he wrong? "I don't know anymore," Kowalski admitted. "I've seen men commit incredible acts of courage and unthinkable acts of cruelty, sometimes the same men, sometimes on the same day. I've seen American soldiers risk their lives to save enemy wounded, and I've seen them execute prisoners. I've seen Japanese infantry charge with suicidal bravery, and I've seen them bayonet civilians. What does fundamental decency even mean when context can turn anyone into anything?" It was a question without an answer, or with too many answers, all of them partial and unsatisfying. Daniel thought about the Japanese soldiers he'd killed with the 10-gauge, about the surprise in their eyes, about the photographs some of them carried of families they'd never see again. Were those men fundamentally decent? Were they monsters? Were they both? Neither. Something else entirely that language couldn't capture. That night, unable to sleep despite exhaustion that went bone deep, Daniel wrote a letter home to his mother in Brooklyn. He'd written many letters since shipping out, but this one felt different. Heavier with truth he usually edited out for her sake. "Dear Mom, I'm writing this by flashlight in a foxhole that smells like mud and fear. I don't know if you'll ever receive this letter or if the censors will black out everything meaningful, but I need to write it anyway. I've been thinking a lot about the hardware store where Pop worked before he passed. Remember how he used to bring home tools that needed fixing, how he'd sit at the kitchen table with his glasses low on his nose working on broken hammers and rusted saws, saying that a good tool was worth saving? I think about that now when I clean my weapon. This shotgun I carry, it's just a tool, Mom. But it's a tool designed to break people instead of fix them. And I don't know how to reconcile that. The sergeant here lost his brother last week. I watched him hold the body and make sounds I didn't know humans could make. His brother was going to be a teacher. He had plans, dreams, a whole life that was supposed to happen after this war ended. All of that is gone now, erased in the time it takes to pull a trigger. I keep thinking about what comes after. Not just after this battle or this island, but after all of it. When we finally get to come home. If we get to come home. Will we still be the people who left? Or will we be something else? Something carved and shaped by this place until we fit a mold we never chose. Jimmy Chen says his grandmother used to sing lullabies about perseverance. I wish I had something like that. Some song or story that made sense of all this. But all I have are the sounds. The shotguns roar, the rain on canvas, the way men scream in languages I don't understand. These are the only songs I know now. I'm sorry this letter is so dark. I promise I'm trying to stay positive, to believe in the things you taught me about duty and honor and serving something larger than myself. Most days I succeed. But tonight, in this hole in the ground on an island that might not matter 6 months from now, It's hard to feel like anything matters, except survival. Tell Mrs. Kowalski that her son Eddie died brave. Tell Mr. Chen that his son Jimmy is the best man I know. Tell everyone on our block that I'm doing my job and trying to come home. And tell yourself that I love you, Mom, and that love is the only thing here that feels real when everything else feels like a nightmare I can't wake up from.
Your son, Daniel. He sealed the letter, knowing the censors would probably redact half of it, knowing his mother would read between the redactions and understand anyway. She'd always been able to see through his words to the